Thank you so much. So, hello everybody. I'm Darwin Tsen. I teach Chinese and Japanese literature and language at Carthage College. Sorry, I'm just going to share my slides very briefly. Let's see if you can see. Can everybody let me know if you can see it or not? Can everybody see?
It is showing up on my screen.
Alrighty. Great. So Katie, Linda, Diane, and we've got one last member here. Sorry, I can't see your name, but welcome and thank you for joining us today. Big thanks to Xander for inviting me to this. I've always wanted to, I've always wanted to be a bit more involved with the community here outside of my teaching or public events, but this is really just a really special occasion. So big thanks to Xander again for inviting me. My colleague, Professor Steve Udry, informed me of this opportunity, and really, despite my tardiness, right, I want to stress that I'm really, really excited to be here. Great. So today, we're gonna do something. I want to talk really briefly about the idea of Asian America, what it encompasses, and what we can find related to Asian America in our town, in our city of Kenosha, in the county as well, and maybe to a smaller extent in the Midwest. I just want to start a little bit by introducing my own background, and I do want to reserve about 10 to 15 minutes so we can chat and ask questions. But if anybody has any questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat in the Zoom chat function immediately. I hope everybody's somewhat familiar with the function of the Zoom chat room. Is it okay if we all try and type something before I start, so everybody gets a little chance to get familiarized with this function? This is something I use with my students a lot because I know it's hard not to participate over Zoom. So this last semester, I let my students, whenever we're online, participate via typing in the chat. So I'm just going to type something and just want to make sure everybody can see it. Right. Xander, you're very familiar with Zoom functions, I believe. So
Yep.
You know what to do. Okay.
If you're looking for the chat, if you hover your mouse over the bottom, it should come up with a bunch of options. Chat should be one of them. You can open that and see the chat.
Great. So hi, Linda. Right. All right. So hello, Katie. So if anytime you have any questions or any comments you'd like to make, please feel free to use the chat. Do we also have the raise hand function enabled, or probably not for this? Oh, yes,
not
reactions.
certain. I think it should be though.
Yeah. Okay. So if we can find reactions, then you feel free also to use like raise hand, right? Or to use, a yes. So, yep. Okay. So, let's take it easy and let's see how it goes. Alrighty. So, great. So a little bit first about myself. So, there's a typo here, really ugly. I will I will have a kind of cleaned up version of the slides to share with the library later. If any of you would like to get in touch with me, or I do have a list of recommendations that I'm still constructing for you. So that I'll be able to send to Xander for distribution later. So I'll clean that up. Sorry. So really nice to meet you all. Again, my name is Darwin. I was born in Brookline, Massachusetts. So this is a little shot of, I think, Brookline, Massachusetts. It's a kind of subdistrict of Boston. And I grew up in the States. My parents were from Taiwan, right? They both came. My father came in the 70s as a study abroad student, studying biology. My mother was the sister of one of his classmates who studied history. So my uncle and my father actually first met. So the date the 1970s is very important because we'll come back to this a little later. 1965 is a particularly interesting year for immigration, for Asian to America, to North American immigration, for a variety of reasons later, right? And I want to emphasize that A lot of what we think about as Asian American culture or stereotypes or associations today actually start with that date. There's, of course, a much longer prehistory, but I don't want to spend way too much time dwelling on it. But we'll certainly have time to discuss that in the Q&A if I'm not able to cover all of the content today. So back to a little bit of a personal touch. So I was born in Brookline, Massachusetts. I spent the first 5 years of my life in the States. Our family did move to an outer suburb of Boston called Natick, Massachusetts. I'm sharing some childhood photos that I have. So up to 5 years old, I was, as you can imagine, a fairly standard, right, Asian American kid, right? I loved cartoons. I had friends, and again, but my friend circle consists mostly of my parents' immigrant, right, inner circle from Taiwan. So oftentimes I would, start to become aware of the difference of myself around myself with kids who are Black or white during preschool, right? Even in the suburbs. So it was a fairly unremarkable upbringing, right? Here, I believe this is one of the Universal Studios. I can't remember which one. I was a big Dick Tracy fan when I was a little kid. So, so far so good. But around 5 years old, my parents, my father got an academic job back in Taiwan, and him and the whole family moved over, right, including my little sister, who was only 2 years old, around 3 at that time. So if you meet my sister, if she comes to the US and you speak to the two of us, she does have a little more of a Taiwanese accent than I do, right? So a lot of my formative childhood years was spent in the Northeast, right? Lots of things common with kids in my generation. We grew up on the NES, right? We watched Ninja Turtles, there was Transformers, all those things. So that probably gives you a little sense of how old I am, and I don't need to give too much away. But between 5 years old, there was a period in which I had to reacclimate, right, my Asian America and my American identity with the fact of living in Taiwan again, right? So for a long time, the issue of who I am, or who I was, or who I wanted to be was a very kind of important question in the front of my mind, right? For the Taiwanese kids that I was going to school with in elementary, middle, and middle school, I was often thought of as very American, right? And not just because of my English accent or whatnot. But when I was in middle school, my parents, because of a conflict between myself and the homeroom teacher, they transferred me to the Taipei British School. So I was again, right, in the presence of not just, right, American faculty and classmates, but also people from Europe, from Africa, right, from Southeast Asia, who happened, a lot of expat children were gathered there. I finished the British curriculum there, and then because they did not have a complete curriculum up to 12th and 11th and 12th grade, then I was finally transferred to the Taipei American School, where again the experience was very different in that the Taipei American School, if you think about it, it's kind of like a school like the Prairie School here, right? It's private, it's very rigorous, right? It's quite expensive, and the level of competition there is just quite different. There, I ran into a lot of fellow Taiwanese Americans like myself, often of much higher socioeconomic class. So that was another different experience. After that, I wasn't sure if I was ready to go back to college in the US. So I actually enrolled in a local Taiwanese university, and I finished a degree in journalism. It was not until after that that I returned to the US for graduate study. This was 2008, right around the Great Recession, that the last recession 13 years ago. And the first place I landed back was Binghamton, New York, right? Binghamton, right? If some of you have been there, if any of you are familiar with New York State, right? There's many terms to which parts of New York it is, right? It's the southern tier, right? There's like upstate, there's Hudson Valley, there's central New York, there's West New York, blah, 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 right? It's a big state, right? But Wisconsin's, also pretty large, but I think New York State, just in terms of sheer volume, I think takes the edge just a little bit. And please correct me if I'm wrong. So my experience back in the US about those first 2 years during my master's degree was really, really shatteringly different than what I remember, right? I remember idyllic suburbs, big, nice houses, right? And what struck me was, really much the beginning of the Rust Belt, right? Binghamton is pretty close to Scranton, right? And Scranton is often considered one of the beginning, right, cities of the Rust Belt in general. So it was there that I began getting really interested in studying Asian American culture and literature, right? As a subject, right? Who am I? Why am I here? Right? What preceded us? And how Asian American culture, literature, and politics connected to, the other multicultural forms of culture and politics, right? From African American to Latinx to, right, to Native American formations. So I would say the first 2 years I spent back in the US in my adulthood was really, really formative and important. After that, I went to the Pennsylvania State University and I got my PhD there. In 2017, I moved from State College, Pennsylvania to Kenosha, and the rest is history, as they say. So, so for me, right, you start to see that there's this thread that goes through my personal experience to my topic of study, right, of Asian America is like, why are we here, right? What did we experience here, right? Who is this we even, right? And how is this represented today? So, so the personal part, I want to kind of go over a little bit of the boring, right, and maybe sometimes a little heavy stuff. That is a few really important historical events throughout this long interaction between Asia and the Americas, right? And when I say Americas, right, I try to include both North America, right, Canada, US, parts of Mexico, and South America, right? That there is a very large global footprint of Asian peoples, right, starting in the 18th and 19th century, of migration and immigration towards the Americas, for a variety of different different reasons, right? So I think earlier I mentioned that there's a really important date, which was 1965, but let's dial the clock back a little bit and remember some of the other dates, okay? So obviously, right, one of the, when we think about history, we think about the history of race in America, in the United States of America, right? One particularly painful date that likes to come up is 1882, right? This is the beginning of the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? And this is drafted in response to the influx of immigrants and migrant workers, especially in the western parts of the US. Until today, it is the only truly legislated document to directly exclude a group from immigration in U.S. history. The formal repeal of this would take another 60 years, right? So I bring this date up first because it's very central, I think, to the Asian American experience, right? Whether you're Chinese or Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, right? You're kind of all affected in one way or another by the kind of orbit of this date, of this piece of legislation, right? And in turn, right, different succeeding groups of Asian immigrants to the U.S. would have to kind of deal with this in a direct or indirect way, right? Whether they kind of sympathize with this or they try to differentiate themselves from the Chinese, right? This is a kind of a landmark legislation, right? A kind of, not so glorious history of our country that nonetheless continues to influence how we feel and think about, right, people as Asian or as Asian American. The next thing, right, was kind of semi-legal, semi-informal waves of immigration, right, through Angel Island on the West Coast, right? Angel Island became a really interesting place and time, right, in that a lot of Asian immigrants came through there, right, waiting to be processed by the authorities, and they left a lot of writings and carvings on the sides of, right, of their holding places, and a lot of this is now currently archived, and many like to think of this period at Angel Island as the beginning of a kind of Asian American literary experience. Okay, so following these dates, right? So since I mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act, I do want to talk about when that was finally repealed, right? So this is right about 70, 72 years ago. Naturalization for peoples of Asian descent to become naturalized US citizens was really only passed in 1948, right? On January the 18th. I remember this date really well because my birthday is January 17th. So sorry about that. But if we think about it, a lot of these historical dates, right, along with like women's suffrage, with African American voting rights, a lot of these dates really aren't that old, right? They may feel old to us, right? That it could be the duration of our lives or, right, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. But if we think about it in terms of the, um, how short it actually felt, right? This was just 2.5 generations ago, maybe 3 at most, right? That naturalization what became possible for peoples of Asian descent, right? And for the Japanese, right, with whom the US was at war with during World War II, it took a little longer, right? It took until 1952 for peoples of Japanese descent to be able to enjoy naturalization, right? So these are some also very, I think the distance between these two dates are what I really want to try to illustrate to you, right? To give you the sense of, for a very long time, Asian peoples, right, whether you were from East Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, or like India, people were living in this kind of, very similar, not entirely similar to undocumented folks today, right? We have gone through a period of legal uncertainty, right? So this is another, right, breakthrough year, right, for Asian Americans in the country in general. So I do have a little article here, and you can click on it later if you are interested. Once you're able to obtain the slides. Okay, so I think we can move on now, right? All right, so let's dial back the clock even a little further, right? The furthest prior we've gone to is, right, the 1880s. So if you think about it, right, the contact between the continent of Asia and Europe and the Americas did happen more frequently than perhaps textbooks or history books would like to say sometimes, right? There is a lot of documentation of a kind of Pan-Asian, Pan-African, right, life world, right, of commerce, right, of trade, of exchange, but perhaps also of war and conflict and slavery too, before the European era of colonialism, right? So when we talk about these histories, right, we don't have to try and beautify it or overcompensate for it, but we can acknowledge, right, that beautiful and horrible things that did happen together in tandem. So one thing, right, that we should be very aware of is that in this period, right, domination, right, exploitation and slavery also did exist, right, between Asian countries, between Asian and African peoples as well. So this is a topic for a big topic for another day. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on it. But what I wanted to kind of draw your attention to from this aspect is that in the pre-European or height of European colonialism, very small number of Filipinos and Chinese people actually reached the Americas as early as the 1700s, right? That would be the 18th century. So caught in the global slave trade, right? Filipinos and Chinese peoples often ended up alongside, right, their African brothers and sisters in the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, right? Most of these, right, the remnants and the historical documents of these early enslaved peoples are contained in the state of Louisiana, right? There has been proof that actually some of the earliest Asian peoples who reached, right, North America and the United States, right, settled in Louisiana, settled in New Orleans, right? So again, that's just another deep can of worms, that another tunnel that we could continue to burrow through and chase. But again, I think the whole point here is to state that, right? That contact between Asian peoples and North America began quite early, a little earlier than we think, right? Oftentimes we'll think it's the late 19th century when Chinese laborers were started to migrate over to California, to places like Cuba, to Guyana, right, to Peru, right, as coolies, right. I hope many of you have heard the term coolie before, right? A coolie is an indentured laborer, right? Indentured laborer who signs a contract and supposedly, right, will regain their freedom after they've worked a certain amount in service to their employer. So I believe the Chinese American Museum of Chicago, again, a really close source, a very friendly place, right, and a very knowledgeable place for residents of Kenosha to visit, right. Personally, I've taken students there on field trips quite a few times, and they're always very delighted to discover how history of Asian American history is documented, especially in the Midwest, right? There's a lot of little things and patterns that are usually not told in bigger stories of Asian America. So again, use our local sources, right? Our library, of course, is one great resource. The Chinese American Museum of Chicago, again, is a really great place, I think, to visit and to learn more about how, Asian American history happened in the Midwest. Okay, so okay, sorry, I'm just gonna check the time really briefly. All right, okay, so we have these, right, big historical dates, right? We do have, right, full naturalization for everybody, including the Japanese, by 1952. 1965, right? By 1965, Congress officially, right, changes the immigration laws in relation to peoples of Asian descent, right? So why is 1965 important? 1965 is interesting and important because of the target demographic that the US government wanted to attract to immigrate to the US, right? There was a very high immigration quota for those who are college educated, for those who are interested in entering specialized fields of work, right? So the wave of immigration, Asian immigration from Asia to the US after 1965, again, and this, if you remember your Cold War history, right, after World War II, right, the US established a kind of little border with its allies, with South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, right, in response to, right, the victory of the People's Republic of China. The Communist Party defeated the Nationalist Party in 1949, and so, right, there's this whole kind of, right, this Pacific Rim that was kind of established by the US government, right? And so naturally at that time, the first immigrants to really jump at this chance in 65 were, right, college graduates, were young people, right, were highly trained individuals, either from trade schools, from Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, right? And my parents were part of that wave. And so this wave of immigrants is very different in terms of, right, in terms of their composition, in terms of their education, in terms of the privileges that they had, in comparison to the folks who came to the Americas prior, right? We had we certainly had refugees, we had immigrants, right, fleeing the war, fleeing World War II from the Pacific side. We had our aforementioned coolies, right? Descendants of coolies, descendants of laborers. We had a lot of farmers, right, from Japan, right? A large percentage of the Japanese Americans today in the West Coast, right, are descended from the late 19th century wave of immigrants, a lot of them who went through Hawaii, right? If any of you have had a chance to go through Hawaii and you sample the food, you realize that, oh, it's really fusion food, right? And with a very strong Japanese influence and native influence. So so the post 65 generation, right, were this generation who came in, a lot of them came in as professionals. A lot of them came in with a lot of cultural advantage and maybe monetary advantage and know-how. And so when we think about like Asian American stereotypes today, right? I'm sure you've all heard of the math nerd, right? The science nerd, right? Again, you have another Asian American with a PhD, right? Sharing his experience with you, right? Good at studying, right? That kind of stuff, right? A lot of them started to develop alongside this post 1965 generation, right? This was a very a class-based kind of phenomenon, right? However, right, as time goes by, right, with the 65 generation, we also start getting, right, different populations come in the late 20th century, right? In the mid 70s to the late 70s onwards, it was, right, the Vietnamese, right, with the end of the Vietnam War, right, our former allies of the U.S. government from the Republic of Vietnam, right, had fled and as refugees to resettle, right? There, if any of you are familiar, right, if any of you go to the Kenosha public market or the Harborside market, right, now it's getting warmer. You'll probably have run into a family of Asian farmers, right? Has anybody shopped with the Xiong family produce before? Right? Sorry. Sorry about that. I should I was trying to press something else. So if like this weekend, if you go to the farmers market, take a look. You'll probably run into them, right? The Xiong family produce. So I'm just gonna type, right, what their name looks like. So at first glance, you might think like, oh, that sounds kind of Chinese, right? But however, actually, right, Minnesota and Wisconsin, right, has the largest concentrations of the Hmong population, right? The Hmong are a group who have migrated from southern China into Laos, right? So this is how you type it, right? And they have settled, right, largely, right, in the Midwest, right? So this is something you can look up on your own time, right? Hmong Americans, right, are, a lot of them have also gotten into farming, right, in our Midwest states, and are generally, prosperous, but there's also a large level of differentiation between internal poverty levels, right? So yeah, and why are they here, right? Because exactly, the U.S. Fought a secret war, right, so-called secret war in Laos during that time with Vietnam and Cambodia and all that. And so, like the aftermath with the Vietnam War, we also accepted a large number of refugees from Laos, and most of them were ethnic Hmong people. So the next time you see somebody with the surname of Xiong, right, Xiong, don't automatically assume they're Chinese, right? There's a very high chance that they're actually Hmong, okay? And at Carthage, we've had a number of Hmong students over the years, right? A lot of them coming from Milwaukee, actually. Some others are from Illinois. So, yeah, so that history, right, around the 70s and the 80s, this was when these populations, right, the Vietnamese, Hmong, started to come over. In the late 80s, we have another wave, right? Towards the end of the 70s, the Cultural Revolution in mainland China had ended. Chairman Mao passed away, right? His successor, Deng Xiaoping, began a series of economic and social reforms, right? Called the Opening and Reform Period, right? If anything, right, for all of us living today, if you have used, bought, purchased, thrown away any kind of made in China product, ranging from really poorly made to really nicely made, this is all a result of the policy that happened at the end of the 70s. So what happened was also mainland Chinese students, study abroad students, started to come over to the US, right? There's a whole generation of scholars in Chinese literature and culture who were around their late 50s and late 60s. These were all they were all study abroad students, very early beneficiaries of that open and reform period in the mid to late 80s. So after the 80s, right, when we think about another wave of immigration, right? This is when mainland Chinese folks started to immigrate over, right? And this contains a huge range as well, right? If you go to, I suspect most, right? If you go to the Hong Kong restaurant, right by one of the public library branches, right, and you speak to the folks working there, right? They're from southern China, probably from Fujian province, right? In the last 20 to 30 years or so, right, our earlier Chinese immigrant generations from Canton, right, from Guangdong, have largely been replaced, right, by newer immigrants from Fujian province, right? Of course, also other provinces as well. But if you go into the Chinese American food industry nowadays, if you talk to, just banter while you're waiting for your General Tso's, you're like, oh, where are you from, right? I bet that maybe 8 out of 10 of them would say, I'm from Fujian, right? I'm from Fujian province. So there's that whole demographic shift as well in Chinese migration patterns. I was watching, I think, ABC News yesterday, and they were interviewing a doctor about his opinion on the recent take on the masks that the CDC had announced maybe a week or two ago, right? His name is Eric Fagel Ding, right? I looked him up, right? So he was actually born in Shanghai, but he immigrated to US at a young age. And now, right, he's a fairly prominent health official, right? A worker, a doctor. His wife, Andrea Fagel-Ding, I think, is a Harvard professor. So they combined their surnames to form this new surname, right? So some of the younger immigrants at that age, as you can see now with Dr. Fagel-Ding, are already entering their 40s and 50s too, right? So a lot of these patterns of like the Asian peoples we see today in the States all kind of result from, right, a lot of historical changes from the 70s and 80s, right? I think in the 80s, it's also 70s, 80s, 60s onwards, right? The loosening of professional immigration from Asia also benefited, right? Indian migrants, right? A lot of Indian immigrants came around that time too. So a lot of the people we see today, right? If you think about our Sikh temple, right? Our Sikh population in Wisconsin as well. These were accumulated patterns, right? Slowly but surely, right? They're happening, right? They're kind of composing this kind of fabric that what we see as and call Asian America today, and especially just at our doorstep, right? In Southeast Wisconsin, right? In northern Wisconsin, right? Where there's more Hmong people, and in Minnesota. Okay, so that was a lot, right? But I guess my whole point is that there were a lot of important patterns and laws passed in the 20th century that kind of really determined what America would look like in the 21st century. Okay, so I'm going to move on to my own specialties, which is literature and culture from here. I'm really not a historian, so if any of you are historians here, please forgive my sloppiness. My my colleague Professor Udry would certainly yell at me for that. So, okay, so I do want to introduce to you to a few sets of what we call canonical or important Chinese and Asian American authors and books and ideas and sets of popular culture. I will have a more completed list to send to Xander for sharing afterwards, maybe hopefully by tomorrow. So if there was an Asian American author who really first broke into the mainstream, got onto the New York Times bestseller list, I wonder it would be this person in the middle, right? Does anybody recognize who this is? Does anybody recognize this lady in the middle? Amy Tan, great. Thank you, Katie, right? So yeah, Amy Tan, her Joy Luck Club, right? Joy Luck Club, which came out in the 80s, was a New York Times bestseller, right? It documents the story of 4 immigrant women from different parts of the Chinese-speaking world, how they escaped from their trauma, how they tried to set up families here, what they had to leave behind, right? So it was also adapted into a major motion picture, right? Has anybody here seen that movie? I thought it's actually pretty good. So if any of your children or your younger nieces or nephews are like, oh, have you seen like Crazy Rich Asians? That's the first great Asian American movie. You should be like, no, no, there's something else before that, right? Katie says both seen the movie, read the book many years ago, right? So it's been a while. Um, what I want to stress is that Amy's Tan's success, right? If you think about it, right, from 1980, right, and that's for those of us who study literature on a kind of 100 year scale, it's pretty recent. But Amy Tan's success was really built on a lot of her predecessors, right? So this woman on the left, this is Maxine Hong Kingston. Maxine Hong Kingston is the author of a few very much must-read works of Asian American fiction. One, The Woman Warrior, right? And the next one is China Men, right? So The Woman Warrior, China Men. So Kingston, right, herself published Woman Warrior around 1976, 1977, right? Kingston was, a West Coast Berkeley kid, right? She was a hippie, an anti-war activist, that type, right, of second generation Asian American who kind of defied the stereotypes, right, as somebody who could just study. She was very, very much interested, right, in questions of women's self-determination, of like gender biases, right, both in the old country, in the Chinese speaking world, and in the US. So Kingston, right, was one of the first, right, definitely not the first, but one of the first to really make the generational conflict style, the generational conflict motif in Asian American literature really, really visible in mainstream, right? We often think about right, immigration experience, the child who learns English faster than the parent, right? The child who has to retranslate things back for their parents, right? This is a very common thread. And I would say even today, right? But although today there are a lot of exciting new different trends in Asian American literature and culture that don't quite follow that mold anymore. This is a really classic mold of writing stories. I believe there is a novel about comfort women, right? Immigrants who used to be quote unquote comfort women, which were essentially conscripted sex slaves by the Japanese Empire during World War II. There was a novel about that and intergenerational trauma. The first Vietnamese American novel called Monkey Bridge by Lan Cao is also based on parents keeping certain secrets or traumas away from their children, right? Who learn English and forget the language of the old country, right? So this is a really, really, really common way in which Asian American authors of the last generation like to tell their stories. So Amy Tan's success kind of builds on this, right? Kind of builds on this pattern from of this literature that has started to come out in the late 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, right? However, I do want to also go back in time a little more and introduce you to this person, Mr. Carlos Bulosan, right? His most famous memoir slash novel, this came out in the 1940s, called America is in the Heart. Bulosan, right? This book by him is a very, very different style from Amy Tan, from Maxine Hong Kingston, right? Bulosan was a migrant worker, right? He never fully settled in the U.S. He came over to the U.S. right when the Philippines was a U.S. colony, right? So he was technically both a citizen and a kind of a minority, right? A minority migrant, right? Not by choice, but by status. So Bulosan, I think, represents another strain of Asian American literature that focused on the struggles of, not just Filipinos, Filipinas, or Chinese or Japanese, but Asian folks as a whole, right, as a working underclass, right? He was a labor organizer, an activist, right, a dedicated socialist, all the way until his death. He basically died essentially penniless, right, because his writing, he could never fully support himself with his writing. He was also sending money back home a lot, right? So for those of you who are a little familiar with the Philippines will know that this term is really important. It's called remittance economy, the Philippines is a remittance economy, meaning a large number of their adult workforce is working overseas as in order to get higher wages with a difference in writing on the difference between currencies, right? Currencies and wage levels. So right, and to mention this is also to acknowledge that within Asia itself today, right? Not Asian America, but Asia itself, there's these levels, different levels of exploitation and hierarchy between different countries, right? When we think about this term, right, the four tigers of Asia, right? Four little tigers: South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan. These are like really small countries or city states, or right, cities that developed, became really rich, became technologically sophisticated. What often happened is that because of a labor, right, an actual decrease in population, growing wages, employers would actually reach out to a lot of Southeast Asian countries and hire workers at a very cheap and exploitative rate. So for the Philippines, it meant a lot of care, right? A lot of care industry workers who came to Taiwan, right? My grandmother's family, my uncle's family, right, the one I mentioned at the beginning, who went, and met my father during graduate school in Boston. His family and my cousin was essentially raised by the successive Filipino nannies who cooked, who took care of my grandparents, who cleaned, right? But under very, very difficult labor circumstances, right? There would be a lot of stories of how Southeast Asian laborers and new immigrants were treated very poorly in Taiwan or South Korea or Hong Kong, etc. Right. So this is not to paint an overtly negative picture, but just to show you that, right, within Asia, and to a smaller extent in Asian American communities, the kind of mistrust, exploitation, and enmity or animosity also does exist, right? The idea of Asian America doesn't always automatically just gathers all of us around and we forget about our history, or we can make peace immediately with certain other things, right? So it's a complicated thing. Okay. More recent, I want to talk a little bit about more recent work that might be more exciting to you. So this is Cathy Park Hong, right? This book is technically not a novel. It's not a book of short stories. It's like a series of essays and little a memoir, again, mixed with little essays. So if you are familiar, right, with the kind of series of books that have become really popular since Black Lives Matter, especially last year's sequence, right, that are aimed for a majority white audience, right? The book White Fragility probably comes to mind, right? How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. But I would say Hong's book here is, I think, also a really nice addition to that list, right? Minor Feelings, right? It talks mostly about how racism or interactions or prejudice with and within the Asian American community comes out, right? Which again, right, often it takes on a fairly different tenure, right, between black and white interactions. So this is I think a really interesting book for those of you who are very curious to discover, okay, what are the things that make an Asian American tick today, right? One of the things I got a lot when I first started at Carthage from my colleagues, again, just having graduated, I didn't have a very respectable wardrobe of shirts and hats and better jeans. So oftentimes, some of my very, very well-meaning staff and my colleagues would mistake me as a Carthage student, right? But I'm 32. I was 32 at that time, right? So something like that, right? Little compliments like, "Oh, you're so young," right? You could be a college student, right? So things like that were really, really well captured by Hong in this book. Barb says, "Love the Sympathizer." Nguyen has another book out. Yes, the sequel to the Sympathizer, The Committed, is actually out this year. So I have to mention, right, this novel, The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen. So Viet Viet is also a professor, I believe, maybe at University South Carolina. I might be remembering wrong. He started out as a scholar, right, of comparative literature, like me, and Asian American studies. He's published a few books, but this is his first full-length novel, right? It talks about the story of a French Vietnamese, right, mixed race person who is a deep spy from northern Vietnam into the Republic of Vietnam, right? And as him and his superior, a general, flee and resettle in the U.S., right? He tries to kind of develop his own life while dealing with his double loyalties, right? And it's both, it's a historical novel, but it's also satire, right? It's probably a little more violent than, right, any book you could read by Amy Tan, but right, it's also right, and he also gets Maxine Hong Kingston's right endorsement right up here, right? But I think Viet's book is very interesting and groundbreaking because I think you finally get a little break. This was published in 2015, by the way. You get a little break from the form of the generational conflict, right? That as an Asian American or an immigrant, you don't always just have to write about the immigrant experience, right? You can write about, espionage. You can write about politics. You can write about food, culture, right? You can write satire. So I list the Sympathizer because it seems to be that kind of watershed moment where Asian American writers feel comfortable enough not just to write about right growing up or parent-child family secret conflict, right? Another author I'd really recommend in the 2010s is called Charles Yu, right? Charles Yu. He's predominantly a writer of science fiction, right? His books are really more similar to right famous postmodernists like Paul Auster, right, or Joyce Carol Oates in many ways. Last year, I believe his second novel called Interior Chinatown, right, which is a kind of a semi-science fiction, right, kind of metafiction description of right about typecast lives in Asian American history, won the National Book Award. So I read it at the beginning of the summer and really enjoyed it. So he's also written a book called How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe, right, which nicely combines the theme of right family, right, intergenerational family trauma and difficulty with right the idea of time travel. So I do have both of these books on my shelf. So I'm just gonna reach out to show you. So here they are. So yeah. So again, I don't want to spend too much time on the recommendation list because I just can't stop. So I'll leave that to actually constructing a list later. So okay, just gonna check how we're doing on time. Okay, so good. I'm gonna move into pop culture really briefly, and then I'll open up our conversation if that is okay with you. So in the 2000s, right, a few Asian American chefs have also really, really drastically influenced the face of American cuisine, right? Not just Asian food in America, but American food, right? So this here is Chef David Chang. David Chang is a Korean immigrant. He grew up in Virginia. He is the chef and proprietor of the Momofuku restaurant chains. Katie's asking display shelves at Southwest. So yeah, this is his memoir called Eat a Peach, right? Chang is, he kind of combines the kind of very perfectionist ethos, right, with the kind of Asian American drive to success. He's certainly closer to like the old school celebrity chefs like Gordon Ramsay or Mario Batali, those folks. So in recent years, right, if you've been following stuff from like Eater Chicago or Milwaukee, there's actually been a very deep wave of reflection upon chef culture, right, upon kitchen culture, right, about the kinds of abuse, the kinds of discriminations, the exploitation that happens in kitchens, and how to work on that, right? So So David Chang's memoir, right, it kind of also deals with his anger issue, right, his drive for perfection. But I mentioned Chang not because of his how he's a celebrity and whatnot, but because if you go to any if you go to any kind of Asian fusion restaurant today, or you go to any Japanese or Chinese restaurant, that has a little, that has, like nice wood interior decor, or if you go to like maybe Sazzy B, if you go to Sazzy B or Twisted Cuisine, maybe sometimes you'll see an item called a bao, right? A bao, right? So the bao is this like soft, right? The soft, a soft bun, a very nice fluffy white steamed bun, and usually what you have in between are some kind of protein, some very savory sauce, and they're folded over like a little tiny burger, right? So this is the object, right? The bao or the bun that David Chang has made famous throughout the whole of the U.S. And even more ironically, Chang is Korean, but that bao is actually a Taiwanese snack called the gua bao, right? The original form again is like this little fluffy pouch. You have pickled mustard greens. You have a slab of fatty pork belly and some peanut powder dressing and spicy sauce if you want. So again, right, it speaks to how kind of translatable certain food items in Asia are to each other. So the next time you see a bao or a bun on the restaurant menu, it's because of David Chang. Next up, we have Niki Nakayama, right, who's the proprietor of N Naka. So she's one of the probably the most visible Asian American women chefs in the industry today. Um, if you have Netflix, you can look up an episode about her, her story on Chef's Table. It's really really inspiring. Um, so I feel like these chefs represent like a different ethos and philosophy and approach to food and culture that are quite different. So Nakayama is not as famous as Chang, but she is really one of the very few Asian American women chefs in the U.S. who holds Michelin stars. So she's also co-authored a kind of children's book about how to become a chef, right? In her episode of Chef's Table on Netflix, she talks a lot actually about the discrimination she faced as a Japanese and Japanese American woman in the realm of Japanese food. Okay, next up, right? Want to talk a little bit more about pop culture in general, right? So, when we think about like Asian American or Asian pop culture, it's actually very mixed. It's actually very transmissible between that and Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx styles, right? On the left here, we have right Thai people, right, who have decided to adopt right a Mexican style, right, in dress and culture, and this is in Bangkok, Thailand, right? In Japan, there has been a developing Chola subculture, right, where musicians and people actually learn Spanish, they learn about Hispanic culture, right, and then they visit Hispanic communities in the U.S., right, and develop their own styles and tributes. Right on the right, we have another Korean American chef who is very different from David Chang. Right, this is Roy Choi. Roy Choi is the proprietor of the famous Kogi taco truck. So again, if you've gone to maybe the new Public Brewing Company and ordered a Asian taco, right? The Asian taco is kind of his creation, right? Roy grew up in LA, right? But he didn't just hang out with Korean folks or Asian folks. A lot of his good friends were Latinx people, right? He got into low riding cars, right? He got into tacos, right? And so for him, it came to him naturally that Korean food and Mexican food had this kind of very good chemistry working together, right? So a lot of what we think about as Asian American pop culture today is, not a kind of a thing that exists separately from African American or Latinx or Native American cultures. So, and I think a lot of these examples kind of show that, right? Some of the more more interesting recent examples, right, also involve folks who take up, right, cowboy subcultures in the South, right? There are generations of, right, Chinese folks who've migrated to the South, right, from the initial 18th century migration to the West, right, but have largely went ignored, right? I would argue in maybe a similar way that the Asian history in the Midwest is similarly a little less well known, right? When we think about Asian American history, it's usually the coasts, right? The story of the coast that dominate our knowledge. So, yeah, here's some clips, and you'll be able to watch them once I send you the links. So, okay, basically this was just kind of a note to describe what was going on with these mixed forms of cultural media, right? I have this book as well. If you're interested in reading it, I'd be happy to send the whole thing to you. But basically, right, I have a good friend who teaches at Michigan Tech University. He's Cuban American, right? All the movies he watched growing up were Bruce Lee movies, were, right, kung fu movies, right? And that was very much a common thing for working class immigrant and minority kids in his neighborhood, right? Between Black kids, Latin kids, the Asian kids, they shared this similar sphere of pop culture, right? Punk rock, skateboarding, that kind of thing, right? So, before I open up the forum, I just want to mention a little bit, right? So, one of the kind of biggest, I would say, Asia-related stories in our part of the state, right, was the arrival of Foxconn, right? In 2018, alongside my colleague here, Eric Johnson in the middle, we organized a series of public forums about Foxconn in Wisconsin. It was a kind of neutral ground, right? Not to promote or not to entirely to criticize, but just to discuss, right, in a kind of community manner, like what the impacts of this would be, right? And many of us, right, many of my colleagues, many of the speakers were, fairly skeptical and critical, right, and not without good reason. If, right, you want to follow up on this story, there's a article on verge.com called Eighth Wonder of the World, right, that really shows us where the Foxconn development is going and what are the challenges ahead. In a weird kind of way, I initially expected them to express some interest in our Chinese majors or students, but because they actually imported a lot of their labor force from China or Taiwan, right? The language skill became a kind of a secondary issue, and maybe because of the kind of level of critical thinking and wariness that was displayed by our faculty and the audience, right? I know their PR folks were at these forums too. Carthage and Foxconn never developed a full relationship of cooperation or anything else, right? Maybe in hindsight that was for the better. Okay, so I'd be happy to discuss this with you as well, right? And can you believe it? It's just already been 3 years, right, since that. So here's some of the resources. I apologize for not having completed these lists yet, but I will send them to Xander once they're done. So that's all I wanted to share in terms of my slides. Obviously, there's a lot more content I could be talking about, but I would love to, open up the floor and to chat freely now, if that's okay with you. Thank you so much.